Good morning.
I like this. This one looks like a pub, not like a sort of boutique.
That's right.
But I'm sure I recognise the outside. I've seen it somewhere
Yes,
before.
it was featured in one of the Inspector Morse series.
Exactly. Yeah. I can imagine him coming here for a drink.
Yes, it was quite nice when they came and filmed in here as well. Enjoyed the day.
But can I have a pint, please?
Which one would you like?
And a proper, you know...
The jug?
Yes, please. But it's a very old pub, isn't it?
Yes, it's dated back to the 16th century. And when the Civil War was on, the troops used to get paid out in here. Yeah.
But you don't remember that?
No, obviously, no, I don't.
So it's very much the kind of place Morse would enjoy, though, isn't it?
Yeah, funny enough, Colin Dexter's in here at the moment, the creator of Inspector Morse.
The chap who writes it?
Yeah, if you want to go and speak to him, he's sat over there.
I will. Thank you very much indeed. Well, well, well. It's like meeting Conan Doyle. How marvellous. Right now, sir. Why Oxford? You're a Cambridge man like me.
Like you, sir, a Cambridge man, yes, yes. I was only there for 4 years in Cambridge. I've been here rather longer, so it's... I think that Oxford has possibly slightly taken me over as a not a stepmother, a foster mother would be slightly better, wouldn't it? I've been here since '66.
Of course, if you'd written from Cambridge, it would have had to be a spy story, not a detective story.
Yes, I think it would, yes. Most of the spy stories from Cambridge. But I came here in '66 without any real intention of writing any detective stories about Oxford. But once I was here, I think I couldn't have written anything about Cambridge. I wouldn't have remembered the streets well enough to cope.
Now, place is very important, is it? I mean, when you're thinking about Morse, you think about him in a place, not just as a person.
Yes, I think it's awfully important for me because I write whodunits. And so really, if you write whodunits, you don't really want to know anything about the police at all, because things don't work like that. So the compensatory thing for me is to walk around the streets, get to know the place, get to know the feel of the communities, like Jericho, for example, just below here. So I've always done a lot of geographical research, topographical research, to make up for the fact that I know very little about the police procedure, scene of crime, and so on.
So it is strictly the place, not the police.
Yes, the police have been awfully good to us here, both in St Aldate's down the road and in Kidlington Police HQ. They've given me lots of advice, but they always tell me I don't really know much about police telephones and so on. And of course, if you have a crime in Oxford, as you know, there are vast numbers of murders in my things here, you don't get somebody intelligent coming along and knocking on the door to you and asking a lot of cryptic questions. You get all your checkered helmeted police in the back garden on their hands and knees. So I had to make up somehow for my ignorance, and I did it by, I think, trying to live and learn something about Oxford as a place.
But do you think the thought inspires Morse, or does he simply try and live up to it?
Well, Morse is in fact a little bit of both. He's a little bit town and a little bit gown. I put him, I don't know whether it was so to do, I put him in St John's, where he failed a degree, like A.E. Huntsman,
yes,
because he met a girl of whom he thought too much. So he left Oxford without a degree, and yet he'd been inside the university itself. So he's part town, part gown. He's not quite sure which he wants to be on, really, but he's in the middle. And he certainly gets invited occasionally to the colleges for a glass of beer. But I think he's slightly more happy in a pub, let us say like this one, where you get a combination of people who come in, like some of my friends here at the moment, to talk and have a good glass of beer. At the same time, we sit in a room where C.S. Lewis and Tolkien used to come every Tuesday and talk about their books. I think it's this, again, this curious fascination of the two things together. Nobody could unravel, really, the town and the gown in Oxford. And I think Morse has felt that he's never one or the other, and perhaps part of the interest of the books is that they seem to be sometimes in and sometimes out of the university.
The Oxford colleges themselves form a background, and not infrequently a foreground, for a good many of the Morse novels and the television episodes. It is, of course, wholly proper that college authorities restrict access to their beautiful quads and gardens, for their main purpose must always remain the pursuit of learning and scholarship. Yet, an interested tourist with judicious timing will find it possible to visit most parts of most colleges. And the television programs have made extensive use of several of them, particularly Magdalen, Christchurch and Brasenose, the latter appearing in The Riddle of the Third Mile under the thinnish disguise of Lonsdale. If the writer of these notes had to pick out one visual memory from all the television programs, it would be the 17th century painted glass, yes, painted, not stained, in University College Chapel, especially the window depicting the Garden of Eden, with the apples on the tree of knowledge glowing like giant golden Jaffas in the infernal serpent episode. The most entertaining cemetery in Oxford, according to Jan Morris, is the Victorian Holywell Cemetery, stacked with eminent dead dons, and now heralded as a wildlife haven in central Oxford. It was amid these slightly unkempt, yet never neglected acres, and only a few yards away from the simple grave of Walter Pater, that Morse found an envelope containing 4 lines of verse written out neatly on a white card. On his solitary way back to Broad Street, he stopped a while for a pint of beer in the rear bar of the King's Arms, finding himself at last in possession of the final clue in the jewel that was ours. There are many fine bookshops in Oxford, and the emperors guarding the Sheldonian Theatre look straight across at the main premises of Blackwell's, one of Europe's largest booksellers. Morse has spent many hours browsing along its shelves, especially in the second-hand and antiquarian sections. And here it was, in the television adaptation Deceived by Flight, that he sought out a work on Zen Buddhism which might explain the curious affair of the man who clapped with one hand. Here too, of course, and certainly from the paperback shop, the whole corpus of Inspector Morse whodunits, published by Pan Macmillan, is on sale for the interested tourist. Here we are then, no more walking to do at all. Downs pointed immediately across the way to the triple-arched entry of the 3-storied building that housed the Oxford Story. Thus reads, probably the very first literary reference to the Oxford Story, in the latest Inspector Morse mystery, The Jewel That Was Ours, in which some American tourists plot their wicked deeds as they sit side by side in the medieval students' desks, slowly spiraling their way through the university's long and colourful history. The ecclesiastical edifice along Cornmarket, as featured in Service of All the Dead, may sound a bit vague, but St Fried's Wides is clearly based on the High Anglican Mary Maggs, with a few details borrowed from St Michael at the North Gate, just along the street. It was here that the Low Church atheist Morse, sniffing the rather pleasing smell of incense, found the fair Ruth Rawlinson dusting the pews. It was from the tower here that 2 men fell, or were they pushed to their very messy deaths. Morse has spent much of his time, and much of Sergeant Lewis's money, in the Randolph, that patrician pile standing on the corner of Beaumont Street and Magdalen Street. Figuring as itself, or sometimes thinly disguised as the Sheridan, this hotel has played a significant part in several of the Morse novels, and most particularly in The Jewel that was ours. The magnificent staircase, which immediately faces the visitor, leads to the St John's Suite, where the American tourists regularly congregated on their ill-fated stay. And it was from room 310 that Laura Stratton looked her last across at the Ashmolean Museum. The Ashmolean is the oldest museum in the United Kingdom, and varied delights await all who step beneath that imposing tetra-style portico of Ionic columns. For Morse, particular delights include the room full of Pre-Raphaelites and the Pissarro collection. In addition to the magnificent Alfred's Jewel, the museum would also have included the fine Wolvercote tongue, had it not been for the strange deaths of both donor and recipient. A brief walk across the criss-cross grid of the Jericho streets is a must for Morse fans, especially the area along Canal Street, beneath the huge campanile of St Barnabas. Many corner street pubs are to be found here, and when the landlord takes good care of his cellar, Morse enjoys nothing more than Morrel's Bitter, a fine pint always available at the Bookbinder's Arms, immediately opposite the little group of houses in Coombe Road, the setting for the killings in the Dead of Jericho. At the northern end of St Giles, where, in a triangle of grass, a stone memorial pays tribute to the dead of 2 world wars, the way divides into the Woodstock Road and the Banbury Road, each playing a vital part in some of the Morse stories. At the top of this road we come to North Oxford, where Morse has his bachelor flat, just below the A40 roundabout, and where he walks most evenings to one of the local hostelries along streets with such happy names as Middle Way and Squitchy Lane.
I think myself it is a little self-indulgent. I get a lot of letters saying, would you please, if we came up, show us where he lives, or tell us what his first name is, or that sort of thing. I think this is a little bit self-indulgent. But on the other hand, I think Morse does represent something of Oxford, and of course something of me. And one of the great reasons, in my view, for the success of the Inspector Morse things has been that John Thaw was very similar in temperament, yes, to the morose old inspector. A little bit melancholy, a little bit vulnerable, a little bit diffident. Certainly within the university about not being quite sure whether he was in or out. I think that John felt that very strongly, and that's one of the reasons why he was so happy to take the part.
And I said biography, and then you dropped the hint. There's a huge piece of autobiography,
yes,
isn't there?
I think that...
I mean, he is you.
Yeah, well, I think that one or two books I had written before any fiction, but anybody green enough to start writing fiction, as I was, and 20 years ago, I think he's always going to be semi-autobiographical, isn't he, to some degree. You've only got yourself to go on. And to invent a character in the middle of nowhere and to give him qualities that are wholly divorced from your own, I think is almost impossible.
But the fascination is it's not just the feelings, it is the place. I suppose Sherlock Holmes, in the sense, was the same, and a lot of Jane Austen, when you think about it, could only happen, you feel, in the town or city she located the story in. And you do feel with Morse that it could only happen here.
Yes, I do. Yes, I couldn't have written about, I think, let us say I put Morse in Rotherham or Rochdale, or it was a Macclesfield or something.
Good place,
like
Macclesfield, yes.
I'm sure it's...
Centre of the universe.
I think that they might not have been so successful, precisely because the one thing you have to capture here if you're going to write about Oxford is the physical beauty of the place. Now then, yes, I'm not quite sure whether Macclesfield, for example, is a more beautiful place than Oxford, but I think one of the huge attractions of most of foreigners has been they see Oxford, which is a very photogenic city, isn't it? and they say, I would like to go there and have a look at this place, even if they can't follow the stories very well.
But that's because it's beautiful. I mean, the buildings, of course, are gorgeous. It's beautifully located. But the history, you see, is part of it too, isn't it? Because precisely you walk down the street and it isn't just you say, isn't that a lovely building? Gracious me, which college is that? But the very mention of the college name then evokes a whole storyline.
Indeed, so when you come to a street called Jowett Place or something, you say, who was he? Don't you? And Logic Lane, or Aristotle Lane, and you may maybe even go and look up Aristotle in the books. Yes, it is steeped in that sort of nominal tradition, isn't it? And of course all the great men here. And the fact that, you know, you tend to say that you're a Balliol man rather than an Oxford man, don't you? You specified almost down to the college structure here.
Would a reader of a Morse book, or someone who's first seen it on television and then says, I must read one, and then comes here, would you like to see them going around Oxford with one of your stories rather than just a guidebook? That in fact the story is a much more fundamental guidebook?
Well, I think certainly if they came along and opened the book, they wouldn't go wrong in the streets. I think I've always been terribly careful about that. Made one or two errors, of course, as the television has. But certainly a lot of people have said I went across the particular streets and places. And I'm sure you feel the same. If you read a book about which you know, a city about which you know, Leicester for me, for example. Yes. I love reading about Leicester because I can visualize myself in it. And I suppose we do have so many tourists here that when they come along and read a book about Oxford, there is the addendum of feeling, I know that street, I know that place, and so on.
As the tourist drives northward through Kidlington, the setting for Last Seen Wearing, a notice will be spotted on the right, in white lettering on a blue background, announcing the site of the Thames Valley Police Headquarters. It is here, in his office in the CID section, that Morse is wont to sit in his black leather chair and discuss his latest case with the faithful Sergeant Lewis. The author of the Morse stories is acquainted, clearly, with only a minimum knowledge of official proceedings, yet the police, both here and at St Aldate's in Oxford, are ever prepared to treat him with a kindly indulgence. Ever prepared to forgive Morse's excessive consumption of beer, provided that he leaves his maroon Jaguar safely locked up in the sacrosanct space reserved for him in front of the HQ buildings. The 10 or so miles of the Oxford Canal, immediately north of Oxford, provide the setting for several scenes in the riddle of the third mile. And the grisly discovery of a headless, legless corpse in the canal beside the attractive little hamlet of Thrupp caused Morse such distress as to necessitate a fortifying few minutes in the boat inn nearby. About 4 miles down canal from here, towards Oxford, is Duke's Cut, a stretch of water linking the canal to the River Thames, where, in The Wench is Dead, Joanna Franks was drowned in most mysterious circumstances. In Woodstock, there was always a goodly choice of hostelries scattered snugly along the streets, and boasting not only an ancient lineage, but also a cluster of black AA stars on their bright yellow signs. This is the setting for Morse's first case, Last Bus to Woodstock, and it was in one of the cobbled courtyards here that he felt sickened as he looked down at the body of an attractive young blonde. At the time of the criminal investigation, 1975, there was no Black Prince in Woodstock, though perhaps there should have been, since the warrior son of Edward III is traditionally said to have been born nearby. The setting for the murder of Sylvia Kay is fairly obviously based on the bear. About 10 miles north of Woodstock lies Chipping Norton, the highest town in Oxfordshire and once an important centre of the Cotswold woolen industry. It was at the old post office in West Street that Thomas Bowman photocopied the frightening letter his wife had received, and looking out at the small fleet of postal vans in the rear park, began to consider the possibility of murder. And it was in a car parked outside the Bowman's house that a dissatisfied and restless Morse was later to sit for so long, waiting for Margaret Bowman to return from Oxford, if she were still alive. The title of this case is The Secret of Annex 3. The trout at Wolvercote has figured in several of the Inspector Morse novels, and prominently in 2 of Central Television's episodes, The Wolvercote Tongue and Second Time Around. The inn, a fine riverside hostelry set between the Weir and Godstow Loch, attracts many visitors the whole year round. But especially in the summer months do its patrons, including Morse, enjoy eating and drinking at their leisure on the paved terrace between the mellow sandstone walls of the inn itself and the low stone parapet that runs alongside the carp-infested waters. Every steam train buff is going to visit Didcot Railway Centre to be reminded of the golden age of the Great Western Railway. And there was one American tourist in Central Television's The Wolvercote Tongue who was particularly anxious to walk around the engine shed there and see the collection of lovingly restored locomotives. Oh, my Cornish Riviera long ago. Morse, however, felt decidedly suspicious about the whole thing, and he and Lewis found themselves puzzled as they watched the American lingering nostalgically on the footplate of one of the old engines. Surely such a civilized fellow could never be a murderer. Or could he? Lady Randolph Churchill, on her first visit to Blenheim, considered the view from the Triumphal Gate in Woodstock to be the finest in the whole of England, and very many visitors would eagerly concur today. It is therefore not surprising that Chief Inspector Morse always found himself enchanted, both by the palace itself and by those magnificent grounds, with Van Brugge's grand bridge and Capability Brown's wooded landscape beyond it, until, that is, in the way through the woods, he was to discover near the northern tip of the Great Lake the body of a man who had been cruelly murdered.
Well, they always say the most important thing if you live somewhere is to sort of revere its past, enjoy its present, and have a few bright ideas for its future. I always think Morse has that too. You feel that he really does. It's good for his self-esteem, but it's good for Oxford that he thinks like that.
No, I wouldn't put it quite like that. He loves being here because it's beautiful, and the litter upsets him. It affects something deep down in his soul, the litter around Oxford. What he loves to do is to chase good landlords for the good beer, because if he does drink a lot of beer, he not only feels happier, he thinks more logically as well. And so it's wonderful to have, isn't it, a place like the Bird and Baby here, where you do get that, where the landlord keeps his beer beautifully, where you can come and talk to your friends and feel that you're partaking both of the academic, cultural, ancestral side you spoke about, and this prospective business of coming to a pub, and not too many fruit machines. Yes. Not too much noise like here, but to come and talk to your friends and enjoy at the same time a glass of beer, and even talk perhaps about the books that we are writing at the present time, as they did in the past.
But as you walk out of the door, the whole place again is there for you to enjoy.
It is indeed, and if you walk out of this particular place into the beautiful tree-lined avenue of St Giles, what better exit from any pub in England?
I would like to think that as long as people come and enjoy Oxford, somebody will remember Inspector Morse.
I think it's quite likely, isn't it, that will happen. They tell me, I don't think there's been any research on it, that about 750 million people have seen Inspector Morse. But I should be enormously glad if I can still come in here and occasionally somebody says to me, as they often have done in this very pub, you know, I did enjoy the programme last night. I think this is the most marvellous thing anybody says, either about a book I liked turning over the pages, Or if they say, I watched Inspector Morse last night, and even if they have to say, of course, I shall have to wait till the repeats before I can understand this ridiculously complicated plot. But I think that this is a very, very real pleasure and privilege for me, and one for which I'm extremely grateful to the city of Oxford.
And if 750 million people decide to come to see Oxford for themselves, let us hope they don't all come at once.
I do hope not.
Colin, it's a delight to meet you.
Thank you very much.